So we've seen the rise of the bourgeoisie newspaper, but there is a concurrent rise which goes on, the radical newspaper, the newspaper which is the voice of the proletariat as well. So this kind of brings me to the end of the sort of history of early newspapers in this country. And it's a very important history as well because it pushes forward an alternative political agenda which becomes extremely important in the 20th century. So where are we at time-wise? Late 18th, early 19th century, we got the rise of an industrial working class, or at least the emergence of an industrial working class that we call the proletariat. Now, concurrently with that, you've got a growth in popular literacy. You know, the effects of the printing revolution are still taking place. And a growth, therefore, in radical authorship, you know, ideas about the politics of the working class and a political consciousness of the working class, which are fostered by these printed materials. Growth of radical societies, beginning of the start of trade unions, for example, which leads to the emergence of a press that serves the interests of this group in society. So you've had press for the aristocracy, you've got press for the bourgeoisie. Now you start to see the emergence of a radical press for the working classes, the proletariat. And we usually call this, you know, sort of radicalism in itself. Within the sort of American and French revolutionary movements, the term radical evolved to become more left-wing than it was sort of middle class or right-wing. A radical branch of middle classes and working class agitators argued natural rights did apply to all men, not just those who were born in a particular way. And within this, you can see the origins of feminism, socialism, and communism as well. And so we're talking before when Marx wrote the Communist Manifesto, for example. So a lot of these things wouldn't have been encoded at that point in time, but you can see the origins of this kind of thinking within the radical press itself. So the first real radical press that we see out there is the Weekly Political Register, founded by William Corbett in 1802, as a pro-government paper for the war against France at the time. By 1804, it converted into a radical paper and became a platform for the interests of agaric labourers and industrial workers, the really exploited people in the Industrial Revolution. It attacked the accumulated evils of the old system. The church, state, and the aristocracy, they became the big enemies of the radical press, and the corruption of bankers and the mercantile system, which served only the interests of those who had wealth. Treatment of labourers and the poor were picked up on, stories, and advocated massive democratic political reform to bring, you know, democratic representation to all members of society, not just the bourgeoisie who are agitating for it also, but also the aristocracy. Now, for those of you who know your British history, you'll know that there's a long gap between the publication of the Weekly Political Register and when this actually happens, but it starts to agitate for it at the beginning of the 19th century. In 1816, they exploited loopholes to print cheap pamphlet reprints at 2p an issue, affordable for members of the working class at the time. And started to get sales of 50,000 a week, which was substantial because that rule about, you know, documents being read out in societies and so on, and being sort of read communally, applies as well. So the rule of 1 to 20 could still be in operation here. So that 40 to 50,000 a week could actually be millions at this point. After the Napoleonic Wars in 1815, the country was in a mess. Unemployment, famine, the Corn Laws, which brought high prices for bread and food, you know, bread in particular. This led to rioting and protests in the streets. The Peterloo Massacre, which was a meeting for parliamentary reform in Manchester, was attacked on the 16th of August 1819, killing 15 and injuring hundreds. And the government passed, in response to this rise of radicalism, the 6 Acts, which had at their root an attempt to control and attack the radical press, increasing taxes and legal punishments for publication. So we go back into a period of repression where, you know, freedom of speech of the press is clamped down on by the government because the government doesn't want to hear it. Does not want to hear the moaning of agrarian labourers, you know. So it leads, what the counterpunch to this is that an organisation of the working class and the emergence of early instances of trade unions. Now, the last radical flourish of all is actually Wales is responsible for, the Chartist movement, a working class reform movement which ran from 1838 to 1848, based on a People's Charter and hence the name Chartist, because it was based on a charter, with 6 reforms which they wanted: votes for everyone over the age of 21, secret voting, no qualifications to be an MP, paid MPs so they weren't in the pay of other people, equal electoral districts, and annual elections for government. The last one wouldn't have really worked, but the rest were, yeah, I'm on board for that. And about 120 local newspapers were established, publishing for this cause, reaching up to 1 million million readers in terms of circulation. Most important of those was the Northern Star in Leeds, which peaked circulation of 50,000 a week in 39. Now, the papers declined after the end of Chartism by 1848. You might want to ask, well, what happened to Chartism? Like, what happened to it? Well, the leaders of it were either shot, hung, or sent to Australia. So, Chartism, the demise of Chartism came in 1848, but South Wales, well, the East and South Wales valleys, and particularly the area around Newport, was extremely important in Chartism. And indeed, the middle of Newport still has John Frost Square, and John Frost was the leader of the Chartist movement. This is what the Northern Star looked like, for example, and these were really newspapers which agitated for political rights for the working class, and most importantly, for better living and working conditions for the working class as well. And these were not popular demands on the behalf of government. So the end of radicalism comes from competition, really, where the respectable press ended the radical press. The respectable press started talking about some of the issues in the radical press and kind of squeezed the radical press out of existence. And also by the 1850s, some campaigns for improved working conditions and pay had been successful. So there was a rising working class standard of living at that point. And so radicalism in the press became less popular, if you like, with the working classes. So there was a decline in working class militancy by the 1860s, and the radical press never really succeeded again in this country, and never really picked up in the 20th century either, despite economic conditions still sucking a lot of the time. So due to changes in the newspaper industry in the second half of the 19th century, we see an end of the radical press. So where are we at? From 1850 onwards, what happens with the industry? You've got a growing daily readership, expanding provincial press, and so you have 3 key processes: the industrialization of the press, the capitalization of industry, which is extremely important, and changing styles of journalism to meet the changing wants of the audience. And I'll talk about each of these in turn. The industrialization of the press really involves new technologies changing production, distribution, news gathering, and content. And news gathering is quite important in here. The role of journalists and how journalists report changes. So in 1868, the rotary press and the linotype in 1876 increased print runs and print quality. So printing became faster, it became cheaper, and became higher quality with these innovations, which meant you had more printed material out and more people could buy newspapers. And simply more money starts to flow into the industry. The rise of the railway from 1845 allowed national daily distribution networks to establish. You don't need localized press anymore. Everyone in the country can read the Guardian or the Times. You have national newspapers now. The telegraph from the 1840s meant journalists could actually send messages in from all around the country. So you don't need newspapers to focus exclusively on one area. You can have reporters in other areas as well. So you have the rise of a national press, and the telephone helps with that in 1876, of course. Typewriter becomes popular after late 1860, so you improve the quality of journalistic writing and how it can be transferred into the printing process. And this all changed both journalism and newspaper production as well. The capitalization of the press. So in the early 19th century, the newspaper was a small concern and can be produced by one person. But by the end of the century, with all these things around technology like the linotype and things like that, where you needed large industrial scale production facilities. So by the end of the century, it was a large scale commercial business. You needed huge factories, print works in order to print. You needed a distribution network in order to get this newspaper out, which meant you had to employ lots and lots of people. The small independent press person no longer exists. They don't have the ability to compete with the larger titles anymore, and the larger titles can only be owned by the wealthy. And we've discussed, the ownership of media in MS100 as well. And you start to see, by the end of the 19th century, that the newspaper industry gets dominated by a few large proprietors who are extremely wealthy, and who, funnily enough, their families are still involved today. And This has fundamental effects on what kind of newspapers are produced. So major capital investment is involved in buildings, presses, journalists to be paid, staff, distribution, all these sort of things. The newspaper becomes a major industry in its own right. And you have changes in journalism. So in the mid-Victorian times, 1850, 1860, the press was built on serious political journalism and a heavy style. But by the end of the century, you had a lighter style of journalism, influenced by the popular Sunday press, which included more human interest stories, sex, crime and scandal. These become the things. This is the foundation of the tabloid press in the late part of the 19th century. What do they like? What do people want to read about? They want to read about disasters. Lots of people dying. We like that stuff. Crime, yeah, murder. Bring me a murder a day. Upper class scandals, huge. Domestic murders, huge. Public murders, yes. Money, this is what I'm talking about. All presented as a sort of middle class moral agenda. The degradation of society. Society's going to the pits. What is the matter with all these people, Ooh, that kind of attitude. And thus it ever was, my friends. And much of the attitude towards events like this today is led by the same kind of puritanical value agenda that goes on, a moral agenda in the press today. So by the end of the 19th century, where are we at? News reporting is faster and more accurate. You've got a professional journalistic class. Where journalists are paid to do their work, and by being paid, they're paid to listen to editors and owners as well, which brings in its own problems. There's a set of journalistic values, objective reporting, public service, and to hold government account, and there is also a set of alternative journalistic values about listening to what the person who owns the newspaper tells you to do. Controlled by powerful owners with their own interests, which are economic, political, and social, and which they use their newspapers to push and make popular. And the radical origins of the newspaper in Britain, so important in each development with regards to the scope of the press, gives way to conservatism and agendas of political and economic control in the 20th century. And that's the story of the early newspaper, my friends. A lot of stuff here is taken from Bob Clark's lecture From Grub Street to Fleet Street, and you can access the transcript of that and the video here. But that's all I've got to tell you about the newspapers today. But we will talk about this more, of course, in our seminars, because that's what we do in those seminars. We talk about this stuff. Yeah.